almost say good morning. It's good morning. And it's the 13th of, what month is this? This is January, isn't it? 2015. So good morning from Pipers'Persuasion. Today's interview is with Iain MacInnes. Iain MacInnes, well known for his studies, perhaps more well known for his piping programmes on Radio Scotland, where he was a presenter and now a producer, but again famous for his small piping and recordings and various groups that he has played with, and we'll discuss all that. And he has a marvellous background in piping, a great Highland bagpipe and small pipe. So, as usual, just sit back and Pipers'Persuasion, Iain, and Iain MacInnes, to people who don't know you. Why they don't know you, I wouldn't know. But because you're well known to me, at least through, first of all, Pipeline and the BBC, but probably more importantly, your connection with small pipes and folk groups.
So I'll kick off the conversation this morning, because that's what it is, a conversation, by asking you just to recount to us what your first encounter was with piping and how did that interest develop, etc.
Well, it was Alan, and it's very nice to be here, by the way. It's a great pleasure and a privilege. Through Highland piping, not through small piping, and strangely out in the Far East rather than here in Scotland. My father was Director of Education out in Brunei, North Borneo, which was a protectorate, a British protectorate at the time, so he was a British civil servant. And my older brother and I grew up there. We didn't hear much by way of Scottish music. We heard quite a lot of Callum Kennedy, I would say. My father was a big fan of him on the old gramophone records. But occasionally Gurkha pipe bands would come through. There was always a British Army regiment posted out in Brunei, and at least once one of the Highland regiments came through. I think it was the Seaforth. And that caused a great deal of excitement. There was a lot of Gaelic being spoken in the house. My parents were from the Isle of Lewis, and they had their pipe band with them as well. So that was really the first time I heard pipes, Alan.
Okay, so when did you actually start playing?
Well, my older brother, I had an older brother called Angus MacInnes, and we were sent back to the UK to boarding school. And the first school we went to was called Blair Moor, near Huntly.
Yes.
It was a prep school, and that's really where we started playing. That was offered on the curriculum, and there was a great guy called Mr. Forsyth. He came out from Huntly Pipe Band. He was an old Gordon Highlander, I think. I think his name was Colin Forsyth. He taught us the basics, really good old style army teaching Highland piping straight down the line. And then for secondary school we both went to Glenalmond College in Perthshire, and we were very fortunate there that Jimmy McGregor was working at the school, ex-Queen's piper, ex-Gordon Highlander pipe major, and a tremendous personality. And he ran the school pipe band, and he also gave individual tuition. And Jimmy was a great source of inspiration to me, and of course to everyone who went through his hands. There were some great players, well, not many, but one or two really, really good players went through the school. Duncan McGillivray, for instance, went on to be very active in folk music, but also a gold medalist.
Stuart Sampson, now of the National Piping Centre, Director of the Army School of Piping, I interviewed him, and he went on the great length about Jimmy McGregor. Yeah. He also went to Jimmy for lessons. And Jimmy, of course, had been a gillie, and they worked with the Bobs of Balmoral.
That's absolutely right. Yes, I mean, Jimmy's own history is fascinating. He grew up on the Balmoral estate, I believe. He was a pupil of Bob Nichols, and would have been influenced by Bob Brown as well. Yeah. He was one of the Queen's pipers on the estate, so you often see photographs of the three of them together, Nichol, Brown, McGregor, playing for dinners. After that, he went to work for the Earl of Airlie, I believe. But during the war, he had a very distinguished war record as well, service record. He was at El Alamein. He was promoted to Pipe Major just a few days before El Alamein. He went into Germany with the regiment and just shortly after D-Day, so he served through the war. He was a real old soldier. If you remember him, Alan, I suppose you might remember him.
I remember him playing
at the great military bearing.
Watching him marching round the platform, playing a 2/4 march.
You're right.
A big robust.
And that's what he was famous for, actually, his 2/4s.
Aye.
He would march, not up and down, but try and do a circle or an elliptical pattern around the stage.
Yeah.
And he really marched to his marches. Do you remember that? He wasn't sort of dawdling in any sense at all.
And Stuart, in his interview, mentioned about Jimmy was very keen in the offbeat, picking up the offbeat, the 2/4 marches, and 1 and 2 bar phrases.
Yeah.
That sort of stuff.
He certainly taught me that way as well in the marches. He'd actually have you accentuating, perhaps over-accentuating the offbeat, the right foot, just to sort of drill it into your head. That was a good way of playing marches. He had a good repertoire as well, I think, Jimmy. He had quite a few settings, particularly of big strathspeys that aren't the commonplace ones, you know, the Willie Ross settings that we
Did
hear
they
so much.
go into the older settings?
Yeah, I'm not really sure where they came from. They tended to be 4-parted settings. I suspect they might just have been northeast currency. I think, you know, that would have been on the go perhaps prior to Willie Ross's publications and the sort of standardisation, perhaps not intentional standardisation, but that's kind of what happened, wasn't it, after Willie Ross's settings came
and
out.
the Willie Ross books in the 60s were the Bible, really.
Yeah.
You know, I remember Angus MacDonald, who was Pipe Major of the Glasgow Police Pipe Band, City of Glasgow Police Pipe Band, and he stuck very rigidly to Ross's settings when we were playing the March of Spades and Wheels. But now I have Ross's settings for youngsters that I'm teaching, and we're going through tunes, and there are quite a few printing errors. It's amazing.
In the original
you know, they've been reproduced, but it's almost as if they've been rewritten to some extent. I don't know what's going on there. It's quite interesting. And I no longer consider this the same Bible as what it was at one point.
Yeah.
But to have
I mean, they were very accessible settings,
yes,
and they were
yeah.
good settings as well,
Exactly.
no doubt.
But Jimmy had his own East of Scotland settings, possibly.
I think he did. I mean, I wish I'd paid a bit more attention, but of course, when you're a teenager, you don't take everything on board. But
From your perspective now, East and West Coast styles, do you find quite a difference, or has it merged?
I'm not sure there's a huge difference in sort of modern competitive piping. I mean, I think where you do hear it perhaps more is people who are taking pipes out of the competition setting and perhaps putting it in a more dance music orientated or folk music orientated setting.
So you'd
And
have
in some
Bobby
cases-
McLeod and Jimmy Shand at that time.
Exactly, and you know, Bobby McLeod was interesting, wasn't he? Because
Yes.
he played the pipes as well as the accordion. And of course, more recently, you've got people like Angus MacInnes, who's come over from Cape Breton, but he plays jigs, reels, strathspeys, these sort of tunes in a very distinctive Cape Breton style, and very attractive style, I think, as well.
Would you
Good for
describe that
dancing.
style to the audience?
Well, it would tend to be a style that would suit the dancer's feet, step dancers in particular in Cape Breton. Perhaps not quite so heavily pointed and
More around,
slightly
flowing
rounder style, and very, very rhythmic.
Yes.
So quite open grace notes probably, but not necessarily fast. I mean, that's sometimes a mistake that people make, that reels are taken off at a real fast tempo, but really they're not. The tempo, these are tempos to suit dancers nicely.
It's more style and phrasing and maybe a lack of pointing or heavy accentuation, depending.
So it's one of these things that's actually quite hard to describe,
Yeah.
but you just have to hear it and you know you're listening to something interesting and different. But Alan, I would say if you actually go back to, we've been doing some work for the Pipeline programme just recently on early recordings with Stuart Eidman of the Whistle Pinkies, and if you go back to even Robert Reid and even Willie Ross, in fact, playing Strathspey, they're playing them a fair lick and a slightly different rhythmic accentuation from the competition pipers of this day and age. And I think they were a bit more focused again on playing Strathspey and reels that actually suited dancers quite nicely.
I get the notion that nowadays competing pipers, the youngsters and the competing, I'm 72 now, so I can afford to call people youngsters. Sometimes they have a difficulty in understanding how they should express a Strathspey. It's a very difficult tune to express. And I asked Iain MacInnes, and he said it's absolutely no problem. I just imagine it's playing for a Highland dancer.
Well,
so that was his answer.
That's actually a very useful approach to doing it.
Aye.
Hamish Moore, the Lowland small pipe expert, he does a good lecture on Strathspeys, pointing out, really, the term is now applied to all sorts of different music, really, all sorts of different styles of playing, from Donegal, Highlands, to the sort of Strathspeys that northeast fiddlers would play, which are very accentuated, very bow-driven sort of things. So what we take as sort of certainties aren't really all that certain. That's maybe what you're saying in a way, and it's quite hard to teach for that reason. But of course, if you can teach the basics well, then people, as they grow older, can make up their own minds, can't they? And then sort of take the music.
There's not a problem when it's just normal performance, because people just express themselves. But there is a problem when they're playing in a platform to be judged in a solo piping context, or indeed in a pipe band context. And it's beauty is in the eye of the beholder, if you like, and that's where controversy maybe comes in here. Moving on, Lewis, Donald MacLeod and his family. Comment there.
Well, I didn't know Donald Allen, but I did know his brother Angus Doyle, boxer. When I was a teenager, the family used to come back to Lewis for long, every 3 years my father got a 6-month long leave, so we'd sort of relocate to Lewis for a little while. In my teenage years I played with the Lewis Pipe Band from time to time, and Angus Boxer, he was pipe major of the Lewis Pipe Band, and these were great guys. They're all ex-servicemen, ex-World War II servicemen, and he invited me up to his house a couple of times just to get lessons. I wouldn't say I was an ongoing pupil of his, and he was very like, I think, Donald in style and in personal expression. He was a very laid-back, nice individual, full of music.
Pembroke there?
I didn't get Pembroke from him, but I did get Pembroke from Jimmy McGregor. He was keen on that side of things, and I learned a nice basic repertoire. In fact, Jimmy didn't win his gold medal, curiously enough, till 1974, I believe, when he would have been in his mid-50s. I was at school at the time, and I remember him winning it, and we were all very proud that he'd finally done it. That's a bit different from modern competitors, where a lot of them are winning the big medals in their 20s, in their early 30s.
Exactly.
But Jimmy's generation, they were caught up in the war, they were caught up in working life, and they really didn't have the opportunity to, a lot of them, to go and
John
compete.
McClellan was quite late on because of the same reason, the war and everything else. You're talking about the Browns and Pembroke, Jimmy McGregor, and very, very traditional, extremely traditional view of how to play Pembroke, and not, I would say, not one particular style, but almost getting towards that direction. Now we have
some discussion, shall we say, on modern Pipers'Persuasion, or recently composed Pipers'Persuasion of Donald MacLeod, and others like John McLeod, what have you, and it's whether they should be put down as set tunes for competitions. And the stalwarts would say no. Donald MacLeod did compose a fantastic amount of modern Pipers'Persuasion.
He did.
And
Yeah.
what's your views on these
Well, I
tunes?
love hearing the Donald MacLeod tunes. I think
Yeah.
they're beautiful, beautiful, melodic Pipers'Persuasion, aren't they?
Yeah.
Aren't they? And I believe is London.
London this
gonna
year is doing it for the
allow
first time
competitors, or
in
ask
many
competitors
years.
to play them. Yeah.
Yeah.
And I must say, I enjoyed the Northern meeting. You might remember the clasp at the Northern meeting about 5 years ago. They set not necessarily modern tunes, but short tunes.
Yes.
A lot of tunes that didn't have Crunlua, Turlua, Turlua, Crunlua variations. Red Hector of the Battles, but
Yes.
loads of others, Lament for the Bishop of Argyll, and there was some absolutely beautiful pieces of
Yes.
music in amongst them. Modern tunes, well, why not? There's not many people.
Well, the
Composing in that
construction
style.
of John MacLeod's tunes are every bit as complex
Yes,
as the
and
older
John's
tunes.
tunes tended to be rather bigger, I believe,
Yeah.
than Donald's.
That's
You know,
right.
in terms of actual duration and you know the use
But
of
it's
the
an
full gamut of
interesting, it's
variations.
an interesting aspect that's coming up
I
this
think
year.
it is. I mean, I think it's good. And I think it's still, I mean, one or two people are dabbling in composing modern Pipers'Persuasion, but I suppose we've got to accept that there has been a kind of dislocation from the great century of Pipers'Persuasion composing, you know, 1640s to 1740s. That's when it was utterly embedded in the sort of the musical belief and psyche of the players up there. So there is a disconnection, I think, and it's harder for people nowadays just to get themselves into the frame of mind where they would compose in that style.
You can't generalise because there were bad tunes composed all these centuries ago and bad tunes getting composed today.
That's true.
So you just pick the best and play them.
Yes.
That's perhaps a nice point to come in with your studies in Edinburgh. You left the school in Huntly and various your primary education, secondary education, and you went on to study in Edinburgh. What did you study and what was the extent of it?
Yes, well, I did. I went to Edinburgh University. Actually, I'm a geographer by training. I did a geography degree. But as a postgraduate degree, I had a cousin who worked at the School of Scottish Studies, Joan Mackenzie, and she pointed out to me they weren't doing much teaching at the time, but they were offering research degrees, supervision for research degrees. So I decided it would actually be of personal interest to do something on piping. And I was accepted by the school and had a grant to cover my costs and so on. So I embarked on a PhD there actually. And what my supervisor was Peter Cook, and we decided it would be good to actually really get into the Highland Society of London and Highland Society of Scotland records, which are in Edinburgh. They're in the National Library and also out at Ingleston. The Highland Society of Scotland records are out at Ingleston. And that was my focus. These were the two big societies started in the late 1770s. They were really, they represented the interests of the landed gentry, really, vested interests. They were kind of agricultural societies and very interested in land reform, but there are all sorts of other things tied in with that, not least the use of land for sheep farming, which in turn led to emigration and so on. So there are a lot of serious political stuff going on at the time. But the societies also had a cultural interest, and they did a huge amount to what they saw as rescue piping in some ways from the state of play in the sort of 30 years post-Culloden. So they started the first competition, as you're well aware, at Falkirk Trices in 1881. They also employed pipers to play for them and things like that, and they actively encouraged publishing of pipe music indirectly and directly. So they were interesting, and the thesis I did really covered that period, the 1780s to the 1840s. Not just what they did, but piping history in general at that time. So it was kind of social history.
So it was a historical aspect that you were covering.
Yeah.
Did you form opinions? Or was it not that type of a study?
Well, what I tried to do is actually put the information out there, particularly about the early competitions. And I did look to some extent at the early collections, Donald MacDonald, Angus Mackay, Angus MacArthur in London, and made, sort of drew some stylistic conclusions about notation and so on.
How accurate
I wouldn't consider myself an expert in this field.
How accurate do you think they wrote down from the oral tradition?
Very accurately, I think, yeah.
You think that was accurate?
And there was a kind of watershed divide between Angus Mackay and post-Angus Mackay and what had gone before, Peter Reid, Donald MacDonald, Angus MacArthur, who seemed to me stylistically quite of one school, one approach. Angus Mackay tended to simplify certain times, or consolidate the grace noting in a style that has sort of, as a thread, carried on down through William Ross and the Pipers'Persuasion.
What about the decoration of the Beaver, cadences, what have you, the lengths? Alan MacDonald has gone at some length, as you know, about these matters. Did you
unearth anything?
No, I wouldn't say beyond. These discussions were raging at the time. The Heherins and so on, and David Murray and Archie Kenneth and people like that. It was all stuff that the Pipers'Persuasion was interested in at the time. I wouldn't consider myself an expert in that particular field. I mean, it's a question of interpretation. I personally like what Alan has done a great deal in looking at early sources and trying to link them to rhythmic singing styles and so on, and the end product is very attractive. Yeah. Equally attractive, though, are people who can tackle the big tunes as they've come down to us, from the Mackay era onwards. I'm sitting on the fence here a little bit, as you'll notice, but I think to an outsider listening,
it is a very difficult subject to tackle because as the years go on, there are different opinions on this subject, and you still get the traditional view that that's the way it should be played, it's been passed down. But personally, I worry about the accuracy of the information as it's been passed down, and how much of a slant that those passing on the information have put personal slant on this information. It's almost like Chinese whispers, where do you go after a couple of centuries? How accurate is that?
Well, there must have been a degree of that, kind of shift over time.
Yeah.
And of course, unfortunately, we don't have early recordings, pre-1920s. Is it 1927 or about then is the first sort of John MacDonald recordings of Peabrach?
Perhaps the best judge is if the audience is enjoying the tune.
I think you're right, Alan. I actually think an audience coming into Peabrach wouldn't really notice huge stylistic differences from one camp to the other.
And right, I think we'll just move on. You did an M.Lit there, didn't you?
That was an M.Lit, yeah.
Yeah.
I started off actually doing a PhD, but I got distracted and went and joined a folk group, which was the Tannahill Weavers, in about 1985, and eventually
we shall be tackling that in 2 or 3 minutes' time, but I just want to finish off the Highland bagpipe aspect in the first instance. That you had famous contemporaries studying and playing with you. Gordon Duncan, you perhaps admired what he did, and Gordon Walker and Billy McCallum, and all these guys grew up with you in the piping circles, didn't they?
Well, I did get to know them a little bit. through competitions. I didn't
Yes.
compete much, but when I did, I
Uh-huh.
certainly came across Gordon and Willie and Roddy McLeod.
Yeah.
I'm of that generation, perhaps a couple of years older than
Aye.
Roddy and Willie.
Aye.
But to be honest, Alan, I really got to know these people best when I was working at the BBC and we were
Yes.
making recordings of.
What do you, just a wee brief aside here, what about the picture of the Highland bagpipe? It's come up quite a bit over
Oh, it's
the
come
years.
up, yeah.
Perhaps too high?
Yes, perhaps too high. I enjoyed the pitch round about the 70s and 80s when it was in B flat. I thought
It's
that
more
was
musical in pipe bands now.
Yeah.
And I understand you had some experience playing with pipe band.
Yes, I did. I played in the University OTC pipe band, and there's a nice band near Edinburgh when I was a student called Woolmet and Dander Hall. You'll remember
I
them.
remember that, yeah.
Norrie Summers was
Aye,
band major. And he kindly took myself and 4 or 5 other people who were students at the time. It was an old miners band actually, so
yeah.
there's some great characters in it, old, and genuine old Dander Hall.
Did you play with any first grade bands?
I played in the Power of Scotland pipe band for a while. Hugh MacInnes was a pipe major.
Great guy.
He was great.
Well, what
And
a
he had a
match
great
player he was, eh? He was a good player as well.
He was a great player. And I was only there for a couple of years, but that was
Quite an
an
enjoyable experience.
Well, it was enjoyable and it was a good education for me in pipe bands and setting up Highland pipes reasonably well, because the band at that time was...
Is that as long as 20 years ago?
Yes, longer.
Frightening, eh? Okay, let's get down to business. Small pipes. Your interest in small pipes. Hamish Muir, what?
Yeah, I mean, I think Hamish and I would have got interested about the same time, and that was the early 80s. And these are these instruments here. But Hamish is a very proactive sort of guy, so he had come across an old set of bellows blown pipes. He was living up in Kingussie or Newton Moor at the time, I think, possibly Kingussie. And his neighbour David Taylor had brought in a set of old small pipes. And Hamish realised, I think, at the time that it was something he could pursue, and he was a vet. And he'd spent some time out in Ireland, and he'd heard a lot of uilleann piping, and he saw it as an opportunity to sort of reintroduce bellows blown instruments into the Scottish piping scene, because as you know, they kind of died out almost entirely
Yes.
in Scotland, actual Scottish bellows, small pipes and border pipes. So Hamish got together with Colin Ross, who's a Northumbrian pipe maker, and they devised pipes based on Northumbrian pipe technology, using, they designed 2 sorts of chanters, one an A chanter, which is like a slightly long practice chanter, and this is a D chanter. But they designed to be very user-friendly for Highland pipers, so the actual finger technique on the chanter itself.
It's more a spacing.
Yeah, the spacing here on the D is quite tight, but it's more the half-open, half-covered system. So you're actually using a system on these chanters that is just as you would use in a Highland pipe. You have to modify the grace noting to some extent. Northumbrian pipes, as you're probably aware, use a covered system and more a fingertip sort of type approach. So they quite cleverly designed small pipes that were relatively easy for Highland pipers to take to without any great difficulty, and you could transfer your repertoire and you didn't have to learn a new technique. With say a D chanter, I found I needed to, rather than use that finger joint, actually go for the fingertips, because you're pretty tight.
Did you find that difficult?
Not for me, because I've got fairly small hands, but people who do have big hands do find smaller chanters difficult. And the original Scottish small pipes, as you may be aware, were pitched more in E and G, so they were even smaller still, directly related to modern Northumbrian small pipes, which tend to be in F sharp, G, E, that sort of, well, F and F sharp particularly.
Famous exponent there's Catherine Tickell.
Catherine Tickell and loads of others. They've gone through similar times. I think their society, the Northumbrian Piping Society, started in the 1920s, 1925, 27, something like that.
Yeah.
Our own Lowland and Border Pipers Society, I should say, Lowland and Border Piper Society, didn't get going till 1981 in a sort of informal style. In 1983, we drew up a constitution and sort of put it in a like
Based in Edinburgh?
It did kind of start off in Edinburgh. The driving forces behind it were people like Hugh Cheap at the National Museum. And Hugh, of course, had loads of instruments in the museum, and he was interested in what they had been and what you could do with them in the future. Gordon Mooney was a guy living in the Lowlands at the time, and Gordon was particularly interested in repertoire. There's a guy called Mike Rowan. Do you know Big Rory, who does the Stilts show? That's Mike Rowan. And he again was just interested in finding an alternative to playing Highland pipes. And of course the great beauty at the time was for the first time we had instruments that we could play easily with other instruments. Because of being pitched in A or
And you've
in
got
D.
a drone system there. Can you describe that?
The drone system on a typical D set, well, the main thing you'd say is you're using a common stock, so all the drones are going into one stock together. And they're just lying over, they're not necessarily going over his shoulder, because the whole system is running at fairly low pressure. You're not putting a huge amount of air into the bag. On this instrument you'd have a D and a fifth, which is an A, is it? Yeah, on a D pipe the fifth is an A. On an A pipe the fifth would be an E. So, and that just, it kind of puts in a strong middle harmonic. It's a bit like the bass drone on a Highland pipe, as you're aware, has this really strong fifth harmonic. Some people don't like using the fifth. Say you're playing an A and the fifth is sounding an
Is
E,
that like a
but the tune's
baritone
in
or
D. It's, you call it a baritone, but if you're actually playing the key of D with a strong E baritone, some people don't like that sound, but it doesn't bother me and Julie. I just see it as part of. I see it's part of a block of sound coming out of the drones. But you could, for instance, if you want to tune the baritone to D, and then you get a really strong D sound to if you're playing D tunes.
That's interesting.
And the other element, of course, is the bellows, which early on we were using Northumbrian style bellows.
And that appears to be quite a big set of bellows. Would that be true?
This set, this particular one was made by McCallum's Thread and Moses Company. They're really for powdering a set of border pipes.
Aye.
And they're quite similar to Irish style.
I love the bells. I play them myself and thoroughly enjoy it, but I take the easier route out. I've got the A.
Yeah, A is a bit easier.
You know, it's easier on the fingers, just for jumping on and off. Why don't you give us a small tune just
Okay.
just a demonstration while we're speaking about the instrument?
So like any set, they need a bit of tuning, so these haven't been played for 20 minutes, half an hour.
Okay.
The pipes, incidentally, are made by Hamish Moore. Just identified the bellows, I should identify the pipes as well. One of the top makers. that's the D sound.
Aye, that's wonderful.
I quite like the D sound because it's halfway between the A and the Northumbrian sort of pitch, so it sounds a bit different from just being a big practice chanter.
Aye.
And other musicians, it's easy for a fiddler to play with it because all you do is play down a string. They don't have to think too much, from then to go from A tunes to D tunes. You're just going down a string. It fits nicely on sitterns and bouzouki and things like that. So it's a good pitch. It's not many people are playing it at the moment.
Your personal history drawn into this instrument, how was this developed? I understand that you listen to Irish folk groups, Blankstein, Liam O'Flynn and the Bothy Band and various folk like that. Did that give you an appetite?
Well, these were certainly the bands on the go when I was a teenager.
Yeah.
The big Irish bands. And then I was listening to quite a lot of Gaelic music, Nahogany and the Lochies.
Right.
The Lochies were the local group in the part of Lewis where my parents came from, South Lochs, Callum Kennedy, people like that. So that was an influence. The style of the Irish groups was very exciting and they were dynamic. They were taking very traditional elements, uilleann pipes, flute, fiddle.
Aye.
Played in a very traditional style but with powerful string backing. And the Scottish folk groups kind of tapped into that when, in the late 70s you had bands like the Battlefield Band taking off with Duncan McGillivray playing the pipes. The Tannahill Weavers taking off with Alan MacLeod playing the pipes. And
Did you play with them?
I did play the Tannahill
I bet
Weavers,
it
yes.
was the great Highland bagpipe you played.
Yes, I played the Highland pipe, though we did play a bit of small pipe behind songs and things, but it was a fairly
So you played
fairly loud band,
Played
fairly-
both instruments then.
I did, and whistle as well, yeah.
And the whistle. How do you find the whistle? Is it difficult?
No, it's straightforward for a piper to take it on.
Okay.
And one difference between those days and now, as pipers you tended to have to kind of find your own way with all these instruments.
Aye.
But of course now, because the courses are running at the Conservatoire here in Glasgow and at Seoul Morostig and in Bunbeckle and in Newcastle, there's another great course down there. There's so many opportunities now for pipers to play pipes but take on a stringed instrument or a whistle or a flute as a second instrument.
And
they're
it's
coming out.
more formal
It's a
teaching.
rounded education.
Yes.
And they're coming out absolutely superb players. And that, I would say, back in the 80s when we were playing in groups, we were kind of feeling our own way at the time. But it was great fun. I played with the Tannahill Weavers for 5 years, and we did a lot of touring
And did
records and so
your
on.
playing develop more towards the small pipes over that 5 years?
It did, and possibly more so when I finished with the band, and I wasn't out playing the Highland pipes so much. And of course, one great advantage of these instruments is you can play them in the house without
Did
annoying
CDs
neighbours.
with the Tannahill Weavers as well? Made it CD?
Yes, well, I actually did vinyl recordings, LPs. It was that long ago. Yeah, I did 3 with the Tannahills back in the 80s. They're still going strong, incidentally. It's remarkable that bands like the Tannahills and the Battlefield Band are still, out there.
Same personnel or a complete change?
Pretty much. Same personnel, except a different piper. They've been through a few pipers over the years. So they've done very well, and they've sort of flown the flag for that style of Scottish music over the years.
And of course, you were still studying at Edinburgh, and you played with Ossian as well.
Well, Ossian was we started a small trio, myself and a fiddler who played in the Tannahill Weavers called Stuart Morrison, and a singer called Billy Ross, who was in the original Ossian. And then Billy Jackson, who was also in the original Ossian, joined the band. The band was called Small Talk at the time, but we did play a bit and made a recording as Ossian as well. It was a kind of late edition Ossian. But the Ossian that people will remember, of course, is a great band with Ian MacDonald playing the pipes and John Martin playing the fiddle and so on, and that band was the best ever.
Well, funnily enough, I spoke to Iain MacDonald just a fortnight ago, and I'm hoping to interview him in February for Pipers'Persuasion.
Great.
And quite an interesting chap. In fact, a very interesting chap.
Iain was a huge influence,
Yeah.
and still is on the modern generation of players,
Aye.
because he's teaching up in Dunbeckla.
Uh-huh.
And his flute style, his piping, of course, was
Aye.
second to none. His flute style was very influential as well. You know, he took in elements of Irish flute playing, but put a very distinctively Scottish Highland twist onto it.
And he's well travelled too.
Well, yeah, he has been very well travelled. Yeah.
So that's wonderful. And what other CDs and recordings have you made with small pipes? I see we have this one here, and you maybe tell us about that.
Charlotte, well, that's one I made in 2009. Quite mostly small pipes, a bit of whistle, a bit of Highland pipes. Made one 10 years before that, so I'm putting one out every 10 years, so I'll maybe get one out in 2019.
Well, we still hope to be around to maybe hear that. What about yourself, Pete? Yeah? And Pete, just dying to maybe ask a wee question. Pete Haywood is helping here in the background.
The very early introduction to pipe, like Jimmy Anderson and the Cluther and Ian MacDonald playing in Canterbury. Can you talk a little bit about that bit, or was that too early for you as a bookie?
Well, it was a bit early for me. I do remember Rab Wallace, of course, playing with the Whistle Binkies, and I was aware that Jimmy Anderson had been making small pipes. I didn't particularly hear him playing them in Clutha. But yes, I mean, I would say that was the real start of a revival. But it kind of took till the 1980s before really good instruments were being made in quantities that people could take them on, you know, and a serious kind of revival of the instrument would start. But I was absolutely agree, Pete, that these people were at the heart of the revival. The revival, I think, I mean, we're talking 30 years in now, so maybe it's not a revival anymore. The instruments are established. You know, every second piper you meet will be playing a bellows pipe of some sort. You know, they'll have a border pipe or a small pipe.
Of course, Fred Morrison has got what he calls border pipes, or real pipes,
Real pipes, yeah.
Which is quite a robust instrument indeed.
It is. I mean, the main difference, it's the difference between a practice chanter and a Highland pipe chanter.
Yeah.
Is the same difference between a small pipe chanter, which is a straight board chanter,
Yeah.
and therefore sounds in a lower octave. The border pipe chanter is more or less identical to a Highland pipe chanter. It's got a conical bore that puts it into the higher octave. So you get a sound that is essentially the same as a Highland pipe, but much quieter. You're using much quieter reeds. But it has chromatic possibilities that the Highland pipes don't have to the same extent. So you can actually get a full chromatic scale through cross-fingering, which is good, but it's a double-edged sword, because if your fingering isn't very accurate, you get all sorts of strange chromatic notes coming in
Of course,
when you don't necessarily want them to appear.
how did you come to work with the BBC, and what capacity, and how did that develop?
Well, I've been there about 25 years now, Alan. I started in about 1990, initially doing small packages and features, mainly to do with folk music subjects or piping. I then did some presenting on the piping programme, the old music for the pipes, pipes and drums actually I used to do. I tended to do the pipe bands. David Murray, Lieutenant Colonel David Murray, he did the solo piping at the time.
How long were these programmes?
Half an hour in those days.
Recorded?
Recorded, yeah. You have to go back to the 70s before, when they were actually live, and pipers used to come in and play live on air. That was good, but difficult for the players. So
Extremely difficult for the people on the sound. I don't know how today's sound men would go on with handling the Great Highland Bagpipe in a studio live and putting it out over the air.
That was straightforward enough, but there was a lot of pressure on the players because they didn't have much
Because you
tuning
made a
time.
mistake, well, you know,
That was it, it was
you
gone.
can't
So,
do a retake.
sort of mid-80s, possibly a bit earlier, it was decided to give the players the opportunity to do retakes in the studio, just to try and get it as good as they possibly could.
I can tell you something that
maybe, I'm quite sure you do know, but the audience won't know that way back in the 50s, 60s, or whenever they started these programmes, if you to play a paper live in the studio, you had to first of all be selected by a panel who was sitting through in Edinburgh, and you'd play in Glasgow, and they would listen through in Edinburgh, and the old stalwarts, and you had to have 12 Pipers'Persuasion ready, and they would pick one and just say, right, play that, and if it wasn't up to scratch, you weren't allowed to play in the BBC radio.
We're not quite so draconian now. Yeah, no. I was aware of the fact there was a panel sort of selected people. I mean, I think it's important, I feel it's important that you give a good breadth of players the opportunity to perform. You know, for many of these players, the younger players coming through, it'll be their first exposure to a wider audience beyond, you know, competitions and playing at pipe band.
Seamus McNeill handled a live programme, didn't he?
He might have done that.
He did.
But pre-Seamus, actually, they just used a continuity announcer. Right into the 80s, actually, I remember. And they had a good BBC voice doing very short links.
Aye.
But the style sort of changed a bit. I guess with Seamus, John McFadden used to do some programmes, and then David Murray really established a style, a very distinctive, very attractive style. And of course our presenter now is Gary West, so it's a slightly less formal sounding programme perhaps than it would have been back in the
And
years.
of course you've extended the length of the programme over
yeah, it's
the
almost
years.
an hour, yeah. It's almost an hour.
That's fantastic, and you're on the internet.
Internet, yeah.
And so they can be listened to rather than if you miss the programme and whatever night of the week. It's currently a Sunday, is it?
It's Saturday evening.
Saturday.
Repeated on a Sunday, yeah.
Aye.
Yes, I mean, the internet has been great insofar as you're reaching a much wider audience.
North America.
Particularly in North America and Australia, New Zealand.
Aye.
I mean, obviously listening on the radio you get a better quality of sound.
Aye.
You get a very compressed signal on the internet. But it's there, and for people who have no other access to programs of this sort, it's a great boon, and we do get a really good listenership, which we appreciate very much. So I think, from my point of view, it's important just to give people an opportunity to play on the radio, and that's what we try and do, is encourage younger players to come in and do a short set for us.
A wee note here, why I'm asking myself. Travelling folk, Archie Fisher.
Well, I produced Archie's programme for a good while. That's my job at the BBC, is actually as a producer.
Right.
And the function of producers is really to get programmes together, decide on content, and then do the physical job of, in many cases, recording all the links and the interviews and editing and
What's
so
the
on.
nature of that programme, Travelling folk?
Well, that's now made in Aberdeen. Bruce McGregor is the presenter, so Archie's retired. Well, it's folk music programme, and it's been going, I think, since the 70s, late 70s, early 80s. And it's a sort of flagship folk music output programme. We also did other programmes, one for instance called Celtic Connections, which we don't have anymore. Tapping into world music. What other programmes, Peter?
Celtic Horizons, it looks like.
Horizons, yeah. I mean, there have been many over the years.
And you,
The Global Gathering, that's...
besides all your BBC work and production work and studies, you also teach piping, small pipes and whistles, don't you?
Well, I do a certain amount of that, Alan, mainly on summer schools, mainly over in the States. Hamish Moore has been running a summer school in Vermont for many years.
Is that popular over there?
It's very popular, and there's a lot of very good players, and they're playing very good instruments.
Right.
But we also run courses, you know, for instance, the Lowland Border Piper Society runs a sort of teaching weekend in February up in Bridge of Allen, and we had courses down in Ayrshire and down in Dumfries. So for people who want to learn these instruments, the resources are there to learn them. You know, you can get tuition, but a good starting point is just get a practice chanter and you learn basic Highland piping technique, no harm in that. And then once you got that, you can explore other options in playing these instruments.
Ian, that's terrific. We've covered a whole gamut of subjects here today, and I'd just like to maybe take you back to your home territory, Lewis again. Just a comment about Lewis and the piping up there. What's the state of the play as far as piping's there?
Well, piping in Lewis and the islands, it's strong in many ways. I mean, as you mentioned, is Don MacLeod Memorial Competition in Stornoway.
Yeah.
There are some very good teachers in the schools. Anna Murray's teaching in the schools near Stornoway and in Stornoway itself. And of course, Lewis has produced some really good players in recent years. James Mackenzie, for instance, who also has a kind of folk music background, but can play all the big stuff, all the big competition stuff as well. It's strong. It's possibly not as strong as, say, down here in the Central Belt, where so many people are taking up the pipes. It's perhaps harder for people to get tuition up there, get hold of instruments, and there are fewer pipe bands as well. And pipe bands, of course, are a great sort of teaching ground, aren't they? A breeding ground of good players, and that's where the Central Belt and Argyllshire to some extent has an advantage. But there's some good music up there still.
Ian, thank you very much for your time and your energy into this conversation today with Pipers'Persuasion. I'm quite sure those watching will thoroughly enjoy this and find very beneficial way of information, especially about the small pipes. And just wish you all the best, and thanks again.
Well, thank you, Alan. Thank you very much.